share the presentation, the actual PowerPoint presentation with you with all of my notes, so you can feel free to read through that. This weekend, I will be working on uploading some additional readings, some articles, if anybody's interested in any additional readings. And if you have specific things that you are interested in, please let me know and I can follow up with you on that. So this week, we're going to sort of take a dive into the history of museums. How did they even come to be? How did museums become established in cities all over the world? Museums today are really the most prestigious and authoritative places to view works of art. And so it's interesting to look at how the function of museums has sort of changed over time. So this week we'll take a look at that history, and we'll examine one specific museum case study this week. Next week, we'll talk about the future of museums. Where are museums headed in this 21st century that we're in? You know, COVID has certainly accelerated our push into the digital world. So we'll be excited to talk about that with all of you next week and look at some additional museum case studies. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen with all of you so we can take a look at our program. Can everybody see that okay? All right, excellent. All right, so in almost every institution's mission statement, you'll find the purpose of museums defined as acquiring, safeguarding, conserving, and displaying works of art of various kinds. But was this always the case for museums? How has the role of museums changed over time? And how did they even begin? And where do we see them going in the future? These are all questions that we're going to explore together over the next 2 weeks. And hopefully we'll be able to walk away with an understanding of how we interact and utilize arts and arts institutions in our world, across the globe, and how those work to function hand in hand with sort of the nationalism that arose here in the States. So over the next few days, I'm going to be sending you guys some updating emails, so keep your eyes peeled for those. But we're going to jump right in. So throughout history, art in the Western world, as we know it, has really sort of been generally commissioned by elite individuals and religious institutions. Art has been displayed in temples, churches, and palaces alike. Private collections were only shared sometimes and on very select occasions under the right circumstances with just the right people. In fact, it's really during the classical period that we find that the word museum has its origins. In its Greek form, museum means seat of the muses, and it designated a philosophical institution or a place of contemplation. Use of the Latin derivation museum actually appears to have been restricted in Roman times, mainly to places of philosophical discussions. Thus, the great Museum of Alexandria, which was founded in the 3rd century BC, with its college of scholars and its famous library, was actually more like a university than any sort of an art museum that we look at. But in classical Roman society, temple complexes served as an early form of an art gallery. Wealthy Romans, including Julius Caesar, collected engraved gems, among many other things, and sculpture. They would often donate these collections to temples. And although it's unclear how easy it was during the classical period for the public to view these items, judging from other cultural restrictions that we know of in records, we can surmise that the general public probably never laid eyes on these objects. Rather, the ability to view these types of art objects was restricted to the elite in this socio-political caste system. The word museum was really sort of revived in 15th century Europe to describe collections of the Medicis in Florence. But the term really conveyed this concept of comprehensiveness rather than a specific building or specific location. The House of Medici, as we probably all know, was this big Italian banking family, a political dynasty, and later a royal house that really first began to gather prominence under Cosimo de' Medici in the Republic of Florence during the first half of the 15th century. The wealth and influence that they had initially derived from the textile trade, guided by the Guild of the Art della Lana. Like other seigneur families, they dominated the city's government, and they were able to really bring Florence under their family's power. And they created an environment where art and humanism could really flourish. They, along with other families in Italy, such as the Visconti and the Sforza of Milan, and fostered and really inspired this birth of the Italian Renaissance that we all know of. But the biggest accomplishment really of the Medicis were the sponsorship of art and architecture, mainly early and high Renaissance examples. They were responsible for the majority of Florentine art during their reign. Their money was significant because during this period, artists generally only made their works when they received commissions in advance. Giovanni de' Medici, the first patron of the arts in his family, aided Masaccio and commissioned Brunelleschi for the reconstruction of the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence in 1419. Cosimo the Elder's notable artistic associates were Donatello and Fra Angelico, and the most significant addition to the list over the years was, of course, Michelangelo, who produced works for a number of the Medicis, beginning with Lorenzo the Magnificent, who is said to be extremely fond of the young Michelangelo, inviting him to study the family collection of antique sculpture. Lorenzo also served as a patron of Leonardo da Vinci for 7 years. And indeed, Lorenzo was an artist in his own right because he was an author of poetry and song. And so it's really his support of arts and letters that was really the high point in the Medici patronage. In architecture, they were responsible for some notable features of Florence, including the now Uffizi Gallery, the Boboli Gardens, the Medici Chapel, of course, and the Palazzo Medici. Later in Rome, the Medici popes continued in the family tradition by patronizing artists in Rome. Pope Leo X often would chiefly commission works from Raphael. Pope Clement VII commissioned Michelangelo to paint the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel just before his death in 1534. Eleanor of Toledo, the Princess of Spain and the wife of Cosimo I the Great, purchased the Pitti Palace in 1550, and they in turn patronized Vasari, who erected the Uffizi Gallery in 1560 and founded the Academy of the Arts of Drawing in 1563. Marie de' Medici, the widow of Henry IV of France and mother of Louis XIII, is the subject of a commissioned cycle of paintings known as the Marie de' Medici cycle, painted for the Luxembourg Palace by the court painter in the 1600s. So although none of the Medicis were scientists, they were also, of course we know, known for their relations and their patronage of Galileo Galilei, who tutored multiple generations of Medici children and was really an important figurehead. And so we see with the Medici family this real interest in the arts and science, and it was really their collection on view to many in Florence that was sort of the first more or less public display of large amounts of art. In the 16th century, the artist and architect Buontalenti designed the first gallery in the building of the Tribuna of the Uffizi. The gallery had been open to visitors by request and was considered a highlight of this grand tour tradition in Europe. The trip taken, of course, by all of the aristocrats through continental Europe, painting along the way. This contained many Renaissance paintings and antique sculptures in the gallery. The well-known painting by Zoffany, the Tribuna of the Uffizi, shows on the left how the gallery might have looked at the time and included portraits of some of the actual visitors. He painted this work for the King and Queen of England since they were unable to visit the gallery and wanted to see it themselves. In 1765, after the Medici family was no longer in power, the entire building was opened to the public as a state art museum, officially known then as the Uffizi. In addition, of course, to the Medicis, overall, the Roman Catholic Church really expanded its collection of arts during this period of time. The Vatican museums themselves were originally founded as collections of works of classical archaeology. The popes viewed themselves as legitimate heirs to Roman history, and the pagan capital had turned Christian. The imperium of Augustus and Trajan had kind of merged with the Catholic and Apostolic Church. And so the monuments of the Roman civilization really were thought of as needing to be preserved, safeguarded, and revered for the glory and the honor of the church. In 1506, the original sort of nucleus of the Vatican Museum's classical works was set up, which is in the octagonal court that we know of today. Here, Pope Julius II displayed an impressive collection of ancient sculptures, including the Laocoon, which had just been rediscovered after centuries, buried on the Esquiline Hill. Of course, this is the reproduction. It was also Julius II who in 1508 tasked Michelangelo with updating the decoration of the Sistine Chapel. The chapel, of course, got its new name, the Sistine Chapel, when Pope Sixtus IV had it restored. Julius had inaugurated the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo's splendid new ceiling at a solemn high mass on All Saints' Day, which was November 1st in 1512. Julius II also commissioned the decoration of Raphael's rooms. As the Pope did not want to live in the same rooms used by his predecessors, because why would you when you're the Pope? You have all the power in the world. Alexander the Sixth, he commissioned Raphael to decorate certain rooms in a wing that Nicholas V had built in the mid-15th century. So Pope Julius basically gave Raphael free rein to create all kinds of frescoes and all of the artworks that he created, which was a grand project that actually continued under Pope Leo X. Meanwhile, in 1508, the architect Donato Bramante had begun work on the loggia. On his death in 1514, Raphael was called to take over the project. Raphael, together with his students, painted the frescoes on the second floor of the loggia, and they are seen as his answer to sort of his rival, Michelangelo. As in the Sistine Chapel, the themes and subjects are, for the most part, drawn from the book of Genesis. And it was also Raphael whom Pope Leo X tasked with the decoration of the room of the Chiaroscuri. Now, Gregory XIII was sort of a hardened and counter-Reformation style pope, and he commissioned the great mathematician and cosmographer Ignazio Danti, along with a team of painters, to complete this incredibly grand project documenting all of Italy's geography with 40 large-scale maps covering the walls of an entire room. And this is right by the Sistine Chapel. The Gallery of Maps was opened in 1581. It's not only a monumental lesson in map making and a marvelous example of sort of the harmony of scientific accuracy with artistic expression known in the Renaissance, but the hall is incredibly impressive. It's 120 meters long and 6 meters wide, and the frescoed maps represent all of the different regions of Italy. Its major islands like Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and the minor ones even, like Malta and Corfu. Here, the Pope could take a walking tour of Italy without ever leaving the palace. The inscription that serves as the dedication for the work unequivocally reveals Gregory XIII's sort of vision of Italy as the most noble country in the world. And the term nobilissima is really meant to convey history, memory, culture, variety, art, and beauty. And so these were areas that were open to many in the court and many in the church. And so these would have been on display, again, to sort of a select group of people. The Gallery of Maps was restored in the 1600s, and the Pope at the time, Pope Urban VIII, also designated a small room for sort of liturgical functions in the Borgia Towers, which adjoined those rooms that Raphael had decorated. And that ornate room with sort of its vaulted ceilings, gold leaf plasterwork was known as the Chapel of Urban the VIII. And that too was open to select few. And so we really see that in Europe, from the Renaissance onward, areas in royal palaces, castles, and large country estates for the social elite were made accessible to their friends and to those in their fellow social circles. That is where really art collections could be viewed. At the Palace of Versailles, entrance was restricted to people who were wearing the proper apparel. Proper accessories could also be rented at stands outside of the palace. So you could rent silver shoe buckles, you could rent a nice cape, you could rent a sword if you needed an accompaniment. So they had all the sort of accessories that you needed to be approved to enter and view the collections in Versailles. The treasuries of cathedrals and large churches, or parts of them at least, were often set up for public display during this period. Many of the grander English country homes could be toured by the respectable tip to the housekeeper when the family wasn't there. And this was really a well-known fact. Special arrangements were made to allow the public to see many royal or private collections placed in galleries. As with most of the paintings in the Orleans collection, which was housed in a wing of the Palais Royal in Paris. This could be visited for most of the 18th century. In Italy, the art tourism of the Grand Tour became a major industry in the 18th century onward, and cities really started to make efforts to make the key works available. In 1734, the Museo Capitolano, or the Capitoline Museum as we know it, opened in Rome. It was established under Pope Clement XII, and it was the very first public art museum, the very first one, and certainly of international importance. It served as the model for all art museums as we know them today. There was a really long tradition in Rome in the 18th century of private collections that had become this sort of semi-public museum. And these were among the premier sites for all of the aristocratic Europeans traveling on the Grand Tour. So in the 1700s, the Pope really wanted the church to be visited by these folks and to show off all the wealth and grandeur of the church. And so he opened the Capitoline Museum for that purpose. Shortly thereafter, the wealthy Borghese family of Rome converted their suburban villa on the Pincian Hill into a space specifically designed to display their collection of ancient and early modern sculpture. The spectacular redecoration of the rooms, together with the reinstallation of the collection, had the intended effect of really turning the villa into one of the most admired and frequently visited attractions for foreign travelers on this grand tour. Although it wasn't a public museum in the most strictest sense of the word, it did deliberately address a larger and more diverse audience, impressing tourists with sort of this dazzling new idea of what museums could be. These spaces were designed to really stimulate social interaction. Well-to-do visitors from all over Europe would come together, meet, and mix in front of works of art, and they were expected to exhibit their knowledge and their tastes in polite conversation with one another. The exchanges were really a crucial part of the experience, and visitors were as much on display as the objects. For the museum really was, in effect, a stage on which we saw them performing this idea of enlightened civility. And this is something that carries through into contemporary museums. Privately established museums really started to begin to be open to the public, and the 17th century onward. They were often based around collections or cabinets of curiosity. And the first museum of this type to open was the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which opened in 1683. It housed and displayed the artifacts of Elias Ashmole, and they were given to Oxford University in a bequest. So you can actually go and see this collection today, and it was originally a cabinet of curiosity. My fingers are stuck together. There we go. So following closely on its heels, the Kunstmuseum by Basel, through its lineage, which extends back to the Amberbach cabinet, which was a collection of natural history and ethnographic works by Hans Holbein, was purchased by the city of Basel in 1661. And this was really the first museum of art which was open to everyone in the world. All citizens could come, regardless of your social class, regardless of your gender. So the Basel Museum in 1661 was the first completely public art museum. And so by the 18th century, we saw this sort of international network of artists, dealers, art critics, really, and collectors forming this sort of infrastructure of this elite art world, bound together by social contracts, but also this shared discourse. Admission to this art world was restricted. It required appropriate social standing, but also this mastery of critical terms and history, and making it really this exclusive group to belong to and excluding much of society. In the second half of the 18th century, many private collections of art began to open to the public. And it was really during and after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that we saw royal collections become open to the public and nationalized, even where the monarchy remained in places like Spain and Bavaria. In 1753, the British Museum was established, and the old Royal Library's collection of manuscripts was donated to it for public viewing. In 1777, a proposal to the British government was put forward by MP John Wilkes to buy the art collection of the then late Sir Robert Walpole. He had amassed one of the greatest such collections in all of Europe, and the British Museum did purchase it, and they built a wing in the British Museum for public viewing of this collection. After much debate, the idea was abandoned for a while because it was so expensive, but it took about 20 years for the collection to ultimately become open to the public. So it was around in the late 1790s that the collection ultimately became completely available to the public. And it was eventually bought by Catherine the Great of Russia and housed in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Increases in wealth and education in the 18th century really started to produce an expansion of the public for art. And this was really reflected in the growth of the art market and the advent of these public exhibitions and museums. Public sales and auctions became this early venue for an art-hungry public. And dealers used all kinds of new marketing strategies like shop windows, newspaper ads, and sales catalogs to seduce this newly moneyed class of people into the pleasures and social advantages of collecting art. Private entrepreneurs really seized on this public enthusiasm and created commercial venues, such as Sir Ashton Lever's museum in London, known as the Holofusikon. We're going to be taking a look at that later today, as well as the Colosseum in Paris. All of these offered these potent mixtures of art, curiosities, and popular entertainment. Then as now, this sort of blurring of boundaries between high and low culture jeopardized the integrity of the fine arts and provoked disdain from this established art scene of elite social classes. The general public didn't really seem to care about these distinctions. They just were really excited to be seeing these sort of hidden treasures. The most significant innovation in all of 18th century Europe, as far as we're concerned in this class, certainly, was the gradual opening of these royal and princely collections to this increasingly broad cross-section of the public. Just as commercial entrepreneurs capitalized on a public that was really hungry for entertainment, governments recognized the propaganda value from accruing and making these dynastic art collections accessible. And so in the middle decades of the century, we saw private and princely collections all across Europe, such as in Paris, Rome, London, Stockholm, Vienna, Dusseldorf, and many others. We saw all of these private royal collections begin to be open to the public with varying degrees of liberality in terms of the public that they welcomed. Accessible and well-ordered collections were indicative of a ruler's taste and enlightenment. And this seemed all the more so when offered to his people as a means of public instruction. And so patronage of museums and related institutions became sort of something you did for the public good. And it replaced all of the sort of ceremonial pomp and grandiose sort of monuments as the age of absolutism sort of gave way to the age of enlightenment. The Bavarian Royal Collection, now on view in Munich, of course, was opened to the public in 1779. This was just a few years before the Medici collection was opened in the Uffizi Gallery in 1789. And so this is really one of the first princely collections that we see on view. The building, of course, now occupied by the Prado, was built before the French Revolution for the public display of parts of the royal art collection. And similar royal galleries were opened to the public in Vienna and other capitals. Responsibility for these collections was entrusted really to the same class of advisors and dealers who had helped to form these collections. And this really gives rise to this prototype of the modern museum curator. Once they were opened to the public, royal collections really came to be seen as national patrimony. Stewardship of them became a measure of good government, and these fundamental transitions, which were sort of part and parcel of evolving towards modern nationalism as we know it, occurred at really different rates in different countries. But the crucial defining moment for them was undoubtedly the French Revolution and the creation of the Louvre as like the paradigmatic public art museum. Access to collections was really limited to what was known as recognized amateurs. So although much art could still be seen in churches and in some public spaces, no matter where the art was displayed, the public for the art really effectively only included those who were critically informed, people who could express aesthetically disinterested judgment, as it was called at the time, meaning sort of people who were in the know and who could react in ways that were deemed appropriate to the art. And we all sort of know this stereotype of the disinterested art connoisseur who can dispassionately look at a piece of artwork and think about it. And it's really sort of the root of that stereotype that we see here. So conversely, people who responded to works of art with inappropriate emotion, who acted excited or overly moved by works of art, were really marked as being ignorant, and those folks were excluded from the art world. Speaking on behalf of people who did not have collections of their own, art critics really started to demand greater public access to art. From the mid-century onward, their calls started to be answered. Academies began to sponsor regular exhibition of their members' artworks, of course, the best known being the Salon in Paris, which started in 1737, but also the Royal Academy exhibitions in London, which began in 1768. But founded in 1793 at the height of the Revolution, the Louvre was really the embodiment of liberty, equality, and fraternity, these whole ideas behind the revolution. The museum was housed in a royal palace that began as a royal palace and now was concerned to be the Palace of the People. Its collection of paintings, sculptures, and drawings was confiscated property and had become the nationalized property of the church and the crown and the exiled aristocrats. And so admission to the Louvre was free for everyone. Shared enjoyment of the nation's sort of newfound artistic heritage really aimed to cement the bonds of equality and of citizenship. The lowest classes of the community did come to the Louvre in significant numbers. Foreign visitors were really quick to note this in all of their travel journals. The physical appearance of many of these folks and their inability to respond in that appropriate fashion to the high art on view made them really conspicuous to the wealthy who were coming from all over the world to visit the Louvre. Republican journals told jokes at their expense, and really sort of inaugurated a long tradition of satirizing the uninitiated in the art world, and revealed, honestly, the true sort of bourgeoisie underpinnings of the museum and the revolution itself. But so at odds with this sort of symbolic role of the Louvre as embodiment of the regenerated egalitarian society was really its value as a showcase of Republican culture. To counter the impression of sort of this anarchic society governed by mob rule, summary justice, and this contempt for tradition, the Louvre really wanted to present itself as the supreme manifestation of aesthetic ideals shared by all civilized Europeans. And so, at least as important as the local public were the educated foreign tourists who would take away with them this sort of lasting image of these canonical masterpieces preserved and displayed according to sort of the highest standards. So to ensure that this was the case, a number of days each week were set aside for the exclusive enjoyment of foreign guests. So tourists would flock to the Louvre on certain days, and on other days, the unwashed masses could sort of come in and see the artwork as they wanted. Seasoned travelers really understood that the Louvre had sort of altered the way in which people engaged with works of art. The adventures of the grand tour and the pleasures of sort of private viewing in these small private collections had all, at this point, been displaced by something that was very new and something that was very public. Early scholars point out that the Louvre had really amassed the treasures of art to excite the wonder of the crowds rather than the sensibilities of a few. So balancing the needs of the poor and the elite, the art lover and the tourist, democracy and diplomacy, all of these things, they still remain a central challenge for art museums and the source of a lot of ongoing tension among museums and their publics, even today. In the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo and the repatriation of his war booty, new museums and galleries modeled on the Louvre sprung up all over Europe. The combined sort of political benefits of a public, state-sponsored art museum proved really irresistible to the governments of the emerging democratic nation states of the 19th century. By the end of the century, every capital and virtually every major city in Europe really could boast a public art museum of its own. And in every case, those museums really featured an uneasy blend of these democratic ideals and the elite aesthetic values. In Great Britain, the corresponding royal collections remained in the private hands of the monarchy, and the first really purposefully built national art galleries were the Dulwich Picture Galleries, founded in 1814, and the National Gallery in London, which opened to the public a decade later in 1824. Similarly, the National Gallery in Prague was not formed by opening an existing royal or princely art collection, but it was created from scratch as a joint project of some of the Czech aristocrats in 1796. So with this gradual integration of museums into the cultural apparatus of the modern state, the question of the public became not so much who was admitted, because in time, virtually everyone was, virtually, not literally, but how were museums being called upon to shape the public in keeping up with this perceived political and social identity? In what ways could museum going really sort of benefit the public and thus the nation as a whole? Throughout the 19th century, utility and progress, instruction, and innocent recreation were really sort of these watchwords for all public institutions, and art museums were not excluded from this. Gustav Wagen, who was the director of the Berlin Museum, put in a testimonial to the British Parliament in 1853. He said, quote, "As a gallery is erected at the nation's expense, it must, of course, be rendered as generally useful as possible, everyone being admitted capable of deriving from it enjoyment and instruction." And so we really see at this point, because most of the museums that were opened were sort of being governmentally run, that these museums were being seen as a tool of the state for instruction and for sort of shaping this new cultural and national identity. Well, museum policy in Victorian Britain was really sort of driven under this idea to respond to the unprecedented challenges that were coming out of the Industrial Revolution. An explosion of urban populations really sort of were teetering on this edge of poverty, perceived immorality, and anarchy. And this prompted the state to really sort of look for new social control and new systematic ways of educating the populace. The desire to control and civilize the masses was all the more pressing as sort of successive political reforms gave voting rights to larger segments of society. And so together with state schools and libraries, it was really hoped that museums would contribute to this moral and intellectual refinement of all classes in the community. And it formed this sort of common principles of taste, to quote from a parliamentary report of 1853. And so this gentleman on the left here was John Ruskin. He was the leading sort of English art critic in the Victorian era. And he was as well an art patron, a draftsman, and a watercolorist himself. He spoke for many of his time when he advocated the role of museums in educating and controlling what he called the laboring multitude by offering a, quote, perfect example of perfect order and perfect elegance. He liked the word perfect. So he wanted museums to provide this example to what he thought of as this sort of disorderly and rude populace. In general, leadership really believed in this sort of top-down, sounds very familiar, sort of trickle-down imposition of what we would think of as sort of canonical values, meaning sort of lifting all people up to a more enlightened level of existence. The embrace of this sort of raw, unkindled masses of humanity in the what John Ruskin liked to call the sweetness and light of high culture was really the preferable solution to a lot of the issues that they were dealing with in society, that the sort of radical alternative option was put forward by Karl Marx. So as opposed to go with Marxism, a lot of these sort of theorists were pursuing the role of museums as these cultural tools that the government could use. Socially conscious museums, which were supported by the state and still by the wealthy and elite, had to do their share to avoid anarchy and promote the gradual assimilation of working classes into this sort of bourgeoisie. So London's National Gallery really went beyond the museums of Paris and Berlin and actively encouraged visits by the laboring classes. More than the symbolic benefits of citizenship, working class visitors were thought to be able to enjoy an escape from what other Victorian critics called the most grim city of stone and iron, smoky chimneys, and roaring wheels. So the London National Gallery really wanted to sort of bring these working class citizens into this pure, uplifting realm of fine art. Despite some of the concerns about the museum's location in the city, how would the smog impact the art? Despite all of these concerns, the gallery remained in central London. And a survey of area businesses actually discovered that the gallery was quite popular as a venue amongst neighboring tradesmen and workers. Visits were organized by the Working Men's Club and Institute, and the Pall Mall Gazette published a guide specifically aimed at laborers, and it went through many editions from the 1880s. In the 1880s, the Reverend Samuel Barnett and his wife, Henrietta, began to organize annual exhibitions of paintings. They borrowed these works from artists and collectors in London's East End, beginning what turned into the Whitechapel Gallery. They aimed to stimulate moral sentiments, patriotism, and a feeling of beauty among the residents of the East End slums at the time and settlement houses. Mr. Barnett there was the vicar at St. Jude's, and he spoke with authority when he said, quote, "Pictures in the present day take the place of biblical parables." So by his reckoning, about 95% of the local population no longer attended church. Organized religion had sort of lost its moral guiding force just when he and others thought it was sort of needed the most. Open every day, including Sundays, for about 2 to 3 weeks around Easter, the exhibitions were incredibly popular. In the first year that they were open, 1881, the exhibition drew 10,000 visitors in that 3-week period. A decade later, attendance had risen to 73,000 people. In 1898, the temporary exhibitions became the basis of the permanent gallery in the present Whitechapel Gallery, which was erected right alongside the public library. For her part, Henrietta Barnett was really an important advocate of philanthropy, and really among the very first to suggest that women could play a special role in outreach efforts in museums and galleries. She said, quote, "Why should the poor spend their hardly earned pence in taking the journey to see treasures of beauty of which they do not half understand, having never been educated to see and appreciate them?" She asked that if women could devote themselves to bringing beauty home to the lives of the poor through the loan of pictures or by taking groups of your poor friends through the museum, they would be able to find a field of work for themselves, a wealth of rewards sort of waiting for them with this volunteer work at the museum. So women really started to follow her example. Her influence, her social influence, rubbed off on all of her friends. And so women were following her example and became really the mainstay of museum education departments and volunteer programs from this point onwards, even through today. Alongside the efforts to popularize high art, an equally sort of powerful variation on the museum was taking place in the South Kensington Museum, which later became the Victoria and Albert Museum. Founded in the West End of London in 1857, this museum sort of offered the opposite approach in looking at everyday objects. Public museums and libraries of all sorts were contributing to the moral and intellectual refinement of the people, but the special needs of modern industry also needed to be met, and so this was the answer to that, a new museum devoted to applied arts and crafts. And so it was opened as the South Kensington Museum of Applied Arts, and it targeted the makers and consumers of these new manufactured goods with a view to sort of raising standards of domestic taste and stimulating the nation's economy. The museum was the brainchild of a man named Henry Cole, and it was built on the popular success and sort of challenges implicit to the Great Exhibition of 1851, or the World's Fair, which had been staged in the Crystal Palace in nearby Hyde Park. The exhibition's success suggested that the great social and economic benefits that could follow from a permanent display of these types along the same lines, while demonstrating that the largest masses of people could recreate themselves, even in this neighborhood of London, was really the impetus behind the creation of the museum. It was believed that they would be able to model themselves and the items that they were creating after what they were seeing in the museum. And so freeing themselves, giving them sort of freedom from moral harm. To be of maximum utility to manufacturers, objects in the museum were arranged by type: metalwork, pottery, textiles, as you see here, architectural detail, and so on. They were chosen from all around the world based on criteria of good taste and design, rather than rarity, authenticity, or any type of monetary value. When originals could not be had, copies were made. Promotion of everyday aesthetics and the conscious rejection of sort of the art connoisseur's priorities contributed to making the South Kensington Applied Arts Museum the most popular museum in Britain. Annual attendance rose from 456,000 visitors in 1857 to over 1 million in 1870. The combination of free admission, evening hours, and a popular holiday could boost a single day's attendance to well over 20,000 individuals. Though the main impetus for the South Kensington Museum was really sort of economic, they shared the view that museums needed to improve social mores by providing wholesome recreational alternatives to quote them, procreation and the pub. And so they said, let the working man get his refinement there in the museum in company with his wife and children. Don't let him find his recreation in bed first and in the public house afterward. So just as sort of medieval England once had its churches far and wide, so the modern world was looking to have its engines of social reform in the form of museums. Surveying Britain in the late 1880s, Thomas Greenwood, who wrote this book, Museum and Art Galleries, found that the example at the South Kensington Museum had really sort of taken hold. His book was among the first texts really devoted to the subject of museums and art galleries, and documented the extraordinary spread of museum culture, really brought about by this collaboration between civic effort and philanthropic largesse. Greenwood was inspired by the ideas of Cole, who started the South Kensington Museum, and others, and believed that museums would foster in the public, including the working classes, or at least what he said were the most intelligent of the working classes, a craving for knowledge, a reverential sense of the extent of knowledge possessed by his fellow man, the duties and privileges of citizenship, and a pride in their nation. And so, although Greenwood believed the state should support museums as it did schools, the police, and public roads, per se, he celebrated the generosity of the local businessmen who were donating to the museum and wealthy philanthropic donors who were supporting these institutions. He described gifts to museums as being twice blessed, blessing both the donor who gave the gift and the public that continued to enjoy the benefits of the gift long after. And so it was with Greenwood that we really see sort of the birth of this idea of this philanthropic sort of do-gooder type of action in donating and supporting to museums. Throughout the 19th century, the art museum was really viewed as a unifier, capable of contributing to society by joining all as one by a common culture, regardless of social and class distinctions. The goal for museum advocates was to produce a society in which a working class family outing on a Sunday afternoon would really become a natural activity. Meanwhile, the museum itself was to provide an example through its exhibition spaces of perfect order and elegance, with spatialized divisions and hierarchies sort of mirroring this social sphere. Visual symmetry, concise presentation, and clear labeling were all vital, but so was the demonstration of progress through the sequencing of objects and traffic flow. A stroll through the museum was meant to illustrate human progress. So this concept, of course, really sort of put anthropological objects at the earliest stages or at the beginnings of museum collections. It was this sort of idea of primitivism that enforced the colonial ideas of the period and also helped bolster nationalism. It also allowed for the respective achievements of different nations to be measured and manipulated to show sort of a home field advantage, if you want to think of it that way. Fostering pride in your local achievement had always been a function of museums and a rationale for sort of funding them. It still is today. The goals and objectives of the Victorian art museums were really transported to the United States, where social reform and progress merged in the early 20th century with the ideology of the progressive era. America's first museums in New York and Boston were modeled on that South Kensington Museum. They were to be a resource where artisanship and handicraft could inspire manufacturers and beautify our dwellings and implements of daily life. Museums sprung up all around the East Coast with palatial architecture really reminiscent of noble residences and Grecian temples. The Corcoran Art Gallery is generally considered to have been the first art museum in the United States. It was originally housed in this building in the Renwick Gallery, built in 1859. Now it's part of the Smithsonian Institution, but the Renwick House's collection of American and European arts were sort of the beginnings of art museums here in the States. At the time of its construction, it was known as the American Louvre. We are at about 9:58 now, and as we begin to go into the United States, this is probably a good time for us to take a little break. So we're just a few minutes before 10 o'clock, and let's all be back here if you want to pop out and grab a coffee or something like that. Let's all be back at around 9:05. So that'll give us about 7 minutes. Does that sound good to everyone?
Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks, guys. All right, welcome back, folks. All right, we're just at 10:05, so I'm going to get us started again. And remember, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. Shout it out, stop me. Happy to take questions at any time. All right, so sort of leaving Europe, coming into the States, coming into the, we saw the Renwick Gallery, but the first true big museum, Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, opened in 1870. And it had as its motto, art, industry, and education. Not unfamiliar with what we've been looking at. It contained plaster casts of original works of art and had a collection of applied arts. Within about 30 years, however, by 1900, the philosophy of this type of museum had really begun to fall out of favor. Wealthy patrons really wanted original works of art to look at. And so in the first decade of the 20th century, a new museum was built in granite and in this sort of Grecian temple style right outside of the city center. Original works of art took the place of plaster casts. Applied arts and aesthetics replaced practical utility as the guiding philosophy. The museum's secretary at the time, we would now call that person the director, but the museum's secretary, Benjamin Ives Gilman, wrote, quote, "The problem of the present is the democratization of museums, how they may help to give all men a share in the life of an imagination." Well, he insisted that the goal of the museums really had to be to transplant all of us everyday folk right into sort of this epitome of perfection. He wanted us to be placed in this area of perfect order and perfect beauty. And so we would be able to contemplate in solitude and in silence this superior examples of past art. The value of art to him and to others at that time laid in sort of this emotional power of timeless, transcendent beauty. So the image on the right is the original Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The image, of course, on the left being where it's situated today. Well, not long after, in 1916, the Cleveland Museum of Art opened. At its opening reception, the president of the Art Institute of Chicago stated that the principal function of an art museum is the cultivation and appreciation of beauty, which is a vital factor in the materialistic age in which we live. Not a new concept at all, but as world wars sort of waged and the world became rapidly very modernized, capitalism was reigning supreme, we see sort of the role of patrons really changing in museums. The purchase and donation of art to museums became a way for the wealthy collectors and donors to sort of absolve themselves of this taint of materialism and conspicuous consumption. It's during this period that we also see the first systematic education programs created. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts employed some 30 trained guides, the very first docent program, and served more than 4,300 volunteers. In 1916, the museum partnered with local schools and led school tours for more than 5,600 students and teachers. Teacher training was offered free of charge, and museum staff visited every school in Boston, distributing more than 25,000 reproductions of artwork for classroom use. The director of the museum, Arthur Fairbanks, wrote that if the children of Boston can learn to enjoy works of art as children, a more wide and real and intelligent enjoyment of art may be expected in another generation that exists today. Well, John Cotton Dana was a contemporary critic of the Boston Museum. He didn't really agree with these theories. He wrote that the institution served the cultural fetishes of the privileged classes. He believed that the air of wealth and sort of this hushed reverence, combined with splendid isolation of a distant park, made art museums really the antithesis of these useful community-based institutions that they thought themselves to be. Dana insisted that museums should serve their constituents through active involvement in everyday life, that they should be grounded in their community and respond to the specific needs of it. The museum founded by this gentleman in Newark in 1909 was founded on those principles, and it became and remains a model of the community museum, which is a model that you might recognize here at the Lipa-Ratner. So while these two models sort of became the basis on which all modern American museums were founded, these sort of large fine arts museums and these sort of smaller community-based organizations, both share many points. Both museum models see museums as democratic and democratizing sort of institutions that had moral responsibilities for education. Though they disagree on the content and the purpose of museum education, with the sort of larger museums looking to be these sort of moral compasses and the smaller museums wanting to respond more directly to what their community is looking for, they both supported school programs and docent services. They both share a concern for visitor psychology and the way in which museum environments can affect an individual's experience. In fact, It was sort of training that was going on at this point in time with Gilman, the director of the Boston Museum. He was trained in psychology. And so he really conducted the first empirical study of museum going and led changes across the spectrum, across the country, in lighting and hanging of art, in seating and in signage, in the interests of alleviating what he termed museum fatigue. And so what you see here in front of you is a clip sort of from this empirical study that he did, where he's talking about all the different ways that someone might have to contort themselves or crouch to view objects on view, and that ultimately you really couldn't stay in a museum very long. You get really bent out of shape and tired about it. So as we saw American museums' commitment to public access really growing and changing, we also see the architecture of museums changing. The historical style of museums, these sort of palatial and temple-like buildings, were really begun to be perceived of as intimidating to everyday viewers. Richard Bach, the curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, said that to make the museum palatial, pompous, or grand is to build up a kind of psychological barrier to its greatest use. So new museums like the Fogg Art Museum, built in 1927, and MoMA in 1939 were built to be more accommodating both inside and out. So that became really the new model for museums, at least until sort of Frank Lloyd Wright's iconoclastic Guggenheim in 1960 rekindled this sort of symbolic potential of museum architecture. So there were all these moves towards open access happening in institutions. But despite this, educational programs really, we saw this growing scholarly introversion happening inside of museums amongst curators. The stereotype of the sort of museum curator that we all think of even today is sort of being tucked away in their office filled with books and being sort of, disassociated with the world around them was really, we see sort of the origins of that stereotype in this period of time. The need to develop consistent standards of classification and display of art, and to be able to discriminate between primary objects for viewing and secondary objects for scholarly pursuits, led to the formation during this period of national and international museum associations and the emergence of real professional identity for museum curators. This identity took shape around the ideals of aesthetic judgment and connoisseurship, the ability to tell good from bad, real from fake. These ideas were concretized into sort of this professional criteria secured by university degrees, and they still sort of are verified also by publications. And the ultimate measure of the curator became and still is sort of the quality and the originality of new acquisitions they're able to make for the museum. The gentleman you see on the left here is Thomas Monroe. He was the director of the Cleveland Museum in the 1940s, and he really believed that there was nothing more damaging to a curator's prestige than buying a fake. Perhaps the most influential figure in this process of sort of professionalization was Paul Sachs. Sachs founded the museum course at Harvard that ran from the 1920s through the 1950s. And he was really responsible for training many of the most powerful museum figures, both men and women, in modern times. Among the skills that he thought were necessary to run a successful education museum were you needed to have a solid, preferably Ivy League education. You must come from a genteel background. You must possess good social skills, which were particularly useful for raising money and negotiating with shrewd collectors and dealers. and you must have bureaucratic confidence. But the ideal curator must also possess sound connoisseurly judgment and scholarly potential. So ultimately, of course, Sachs Museum course at Harvard led to most curators becoming sort of lost in their specialties and forgetting the very purpose of the museum, which was its service to the public during this time. Theodore Lowe was a pupil of his, went through the Harvard Museum course. And he wrote in 1942 of the failure of art museums to live up to the democratic promise of their founding charters. He laid much of the blame for this failure on the seductive charms of collecting and scholarship. The mutual interest of benefactors and directors and curators in collection building on the European model had sort of reduced museum education to what was thought of as sort of a necessary evil. As a result, museums were drifting further and further away from the public during this time. And the approach to the public had sort of been ignored in favor of training connoisseurs for curatorial work. So the director of the Metropolitan Museum, Francis Henry Taylor, really sort of followed suit, arguing that we had placed art both literally and figuratively on pedestals beyond the reach of the common man, that everyone could visit the museum on occasion, but you would take from it little or nothing of what it might potentially offer you, which was nobody's fault but the museum's. So instead of trying to interpret collections, museums had been deliberately sort of high-hatted and been calling everything scholarship. I think we're all familiar with those experiences. So the director of the Met really believed that there had to be less emphasis upon sort of attribution to a specific artist, less emphasis on the masterwork of the artist, and greater emphasis on what works of art can mean in relation to time and place of its creation. And a more generous attitude on the part of education and reaching out to school groups and to the masses. What all of these men were really sort of speaking to is this balance between the goals of collecting and interpreting art, this equilibrium that's really difficult to establish owing to an imbalanced power structure within museums. On one side, you had collectors and directors who were upholding these sort of elite standards inherited from Europe. And on the other side, you have your museum educators who were really mindful of this sort of broad public hungry for knowledge, hungry for art. So as the work of interpretation was left increasingly to the education departments, which were often housed in back corners of museums, staffed by women volunteers, curators, who were typically men at this period, became increasingly concerned with sort of refining the conditions of display. An international conference of museum professionals in Madrid in 1934 saw an overwhelming majority in favor of isolating works of art for pure visual consumption. In 1937, at the Exposition Internationale in Paris, an exhibition displaying the latest trends in museum design noted this movement towards viewing art as an autonomous individual and purely formal phenomenon. The modern sensibility, no longer seeking in a work of art a historical witness, but an individual aesthetic phenomenon, has led museums to efface themselves behind the masterpieces they display. Walls stripped of decor are nothing more than abstract backgrounds against which the objects are to be viewed. The objects must be well spaced in order that the visitor examine each one without distraction of another, all in keeping with the demands of the modern aesthetic. And so we really see this sort of shift in museum display. These distinctions even included wall labels. If you can believe it, museum professionals at the time believed that the works should speak for themselves. Benjamin Ives Gilman, who you may remember began the docent program at the museum, at the Boston Museum, began to believe that instruction was a distraction as well. When the new Boston Museum was under construction, he experimented with a gallery, displaying all of the art with no labels. He wrote that the impression was that kind of ideal condition, surely to be realized in a museum of the future. I think he would be disappointed. I'll just say that. In 1945, Kenneth Clark, the director of the National Gallery in London, whom you see here, insisted that with works of art, the important thing in our direct response is our direct response to them. We do not value pictures as documents. We do not want to know about them. We want to know them themselves. And explanations often interfere with our responses. So even in the 1970s, we see this sort of lack of educational materials in museums. The Cleveland Museum wrote that explanatory gallery labels must be keep their text to a minimum to avoid intruding between the visitor and the work of art. And so the division between the Fine Art Museum and the Community Museum really sort of began to grow during this period of time. Prominent art critic at the time, Walter Pock, wrote in 1948 that the spread of education programs, such as docent tours, threatens to overshadow the museum's original purpose, which is simply to collect and display masterpieces. So once again, we sort of see elitism rising in the museum field. The very public itself was begun once again to be seen as a nuisance to be tolerated but not indulged. John Walker, the director of the National Gallery in Washington, pictured here, wrote, "When the doors of the museum are closed at the end of the day, a metamorphosis occurs, and the director or curator is transformed into the prince, strolling alone through his palace with the occasional bowing watchman, accompanied by a dog, the only obsequious courtier. The high vaulted ceilings and shadowy corridors and soaring columns seem to have been solely designed for their pleasure, and all the paintings and sculpture, the great achievements of human genius, exist for no one but him. Undisturbed by the visitor, I can experience from time to time marvelous instances of rapt contemplation when spectator and work of art are in perfect communion. Can life offer any greater pleasure than these moments of complete absorption in beauty?" Well, if the image of the Victorian Museum was that of healthy-sized crowds seeking wholesome recreation, the 20th century curatorial ideal was that of the installation shot, ridding the gallery completely of visitors altogether. In the wake of World War II and the rise of the Cold War, art became the embodiment, though, of individual freedom. And this freedom extended to the public to enjoy a museum's contents without interruption, at least of a social nature. And so this triumph of sort of silent contemplation in the museum reversed the social activism of the 20s and 30s, and with it the appeal of museums for the uninitiated crowds. Museum attendance plummeted by more than 40 and 50% in some cases, and more than 30% across the board. Many educational programs carried on for decades in this manner, and directors and trustees continued to falsely believe that they were doing their jobs, serving their communities. But the world around museums was changing. And in the 1960s, following widespread social unrest, financial crisis, many museums, especially those in urban settings, sort of awoke to find themselves completely out of touch with social developments. In the wake of race riots, anti-war demonstrations, student activism, and presidential reports that concluded that America had actually divided into two countries, privileged and poor, black and white, Thomas Hoving, the director of the Met, addressed the American Association of Museums in 1968. He encouraged his colleagues to, quote, "get ourselves involved and become far more relevant." His goal was to hold his institution accountable to both its charter and the social dynamics of the day. To that end, he promised, and to some extent was able to deliver, changes in education, outreach, staffing, and education programming. He's best known for his promotion of exhibitions, and his inaugural show, Harlem on My Mind, was a really bold attempt to bring pressing social issues and underrepresented constituencies into a mainstream art museum. Unfortunately, everything about the exhibition was sort of miscalculated, and ultimately, it really became an expression of the white man's conception of the Black history and experience. So it was not well received. However, the Smithsonian's director, S. Dillon Ripley, seen on the far left, created the Anacostia Museum in 1967 in Washington, D.C. Going back to that idea of a community museum, he opened in a really depressed section of the city this small museum. It was led by John Kennard, seen on the right, a prominent member of the local community. And the museum focused on social issues affecting its constituents and its neighbors. Ripley explained that in light of recent upheavals, he was tested by the problem of how to extend the museum's benefits to everyone, those who most deserve to have the fun of seeing and of being seen in a museum. He wrote that if the art museum had become a symbol only to the community leaders and those conditioned to the concept of getting ahead, who realized that art was a subject of elitist veneration and that culture should be subscribed to and taken in doses like vitamins, that of course museums had failed. And so he opened this museum, which remains today a very integral part of the Smithsonian's outreach program. All of these initiatives were part of a really broader trend of self-evaluation and response that preoccupied the museum field from the 1960s through the 1980s. And it once again really sort of heightened these tensions between the goals of collecting and public outreach that was found in every museum's mission statement. Nancy Hanks, who was the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, wrote in 1970 that we could no longer spend time discussing the role of the museum as a repository of treasures versus its public role. It simply has to be both. Incentives to move in that direction came from government agencies and private corporations that offered museums, who were of course now sort of plagued by rising costs, much needed financial assistance in exchange for increased accountability in the form of higher attendance and greater public programming. Social activism fueled this sort of revisionist art history and the first wave of academic museum critiques. Social art historians criticized museums for mystifying art and neglecting the original context and meaning of the objects displayed. Art appreciation, connoisseurship, and formalism became sort of code words for elitism, and they really began to lose ground in academia. Ideas of genius, quality, tradition, and the very canon were sort of denounced as constructs of the privileged Western ideology. And so during this time, we also see efforts to draw in the public align with the business plans of museums in the creation of museum shops and restaurants, as well as blockbuster exhibitions and the expansion of museum buildings to accommodate these new spaces. Where once architecture was criticized as a barrier to public use, now new buildings were hailed as sort of these democratic attractions in themselves. I.M. Pei's Boston Museum wing was described as a temple of cultural democracy. His high-profile additions to the National Gallery in Washington and, of course, the Louvre in Paris helped to redefine the art museum as a multi-purpose leisure destination. Although museum audiences have grown, their profile ultimately has not changed very much. Gains in attendance size at art museums are really the product of a swelling population of educated and somewhat affluent culture, consumers, which is a term that was coined for those whose appetite for art has sort of been whetted by university art history courses, by TV, by movies, and by all kinds of entertainment. In many large museums, we saw populism sort of descend into cynical marketing as museums and corporations both pursued exhibitions that were not terribly scholarly, but were more sort of what would sell. Hence, sort of a steady diet across this time period of impressionism, mummies, anything with gold in the title. And so we see really this struggle to both entertain and educate continuing, even today in modern museums. We continue to harbor these sort of utopian expectations about the role of art in museums in Western society. Because they're educational and good for us, however that's defined, they should be made available to everyone. But at the same time, because we don't fund museums or compel people to attend them as we do school, they're left to attract visitors as best they can, with shops and shows, making them most accessible to those who are willing to pay the price of admission. In the late 20th and now in the 21st century, we see really the emergence then of new museums for different publics. As social activism and critical theory have sort of discredited the aesthetic philosophy of the Universal Survey Museum and the idea that there is a oneness of the public even for art, we see that now no single museum can really please or serve everybody all the time. 100 years ago, mainstream art museums sort of stood alone at the center of a community, defining art and embracing everyone. Now they struggle to represent everything we want to call art and clearly serve some sectors of the community better than others. So now we see that they're joined by dozens of sort of alternative museums and display spaces that accommodate ranges of artistic productions and target previously sort of underserved interests and publics. In St. Petersburg, we see not only the Museum of Fine Arts, which is really sort of that more traditional survey museum, but we see the Carter G. Woodson African American Museum, the Holocaust Museum, the Imagine Glass Museum, and soon even the Museum of American Arts and Crafts. Again, sort of an applied arts museum. If the British Museum displays its Benin bronzes as art and fails to acknowledge these sort of disputed circumstances of their acquisition, so to speak, well, you can just go across to the Horniman Museum in South London, which provides an alternative perspective and includes the opinions of Nigerians living in London. Where the Boston Museum of Art displays African masks per se as autonomous works of art, the Peabody Museum, just over the bridge in Cambridge, provides really this rich socio-political context for the same objects. Increasingly different in themselves, museums serve different purposes for different people. It's the diversity and flexibility of art museums, our ability to give various publics a variety of experiences across a broad museological landscape that really ensures long-term survival of museums. That's a lot. That's a whole lot. And so this sort of leads us to understand how the function of art museums has changed over time, which is integral in really sort of understanding where we are right now, where we're still dealing with a lot of these kinds of struggles. We're still dealing with a lot of these issues that confront us between scholarly pursuits, community outreach, funding, certainly trying to attract folks with flashy shows, but at the same time pursuing sort of the more lofty goals. So really we've been dealing in this period from the 1960s onwards with this sort of the contemporary museum issues. And so understanding what sort of led us to this point will also help us in understanding the future of art museums, which is something that we're going to be exploring next week. And so the future of art museums, we've sort of been propelled a little quicker into with COVID, but that's really provided us a lot of opportunities to see what the future is going to look like in many ways. So we're going to sort of move from the history of art museums and talk about one of those very first museums that opened up. We're going to explore sort of the history of one single museum today as a case study, and that is the Halafusikon, which was in London. The Halafusikon was the museum of Sir Ashton Lever. The museum opened its doors in the Leicester House in Leicester Square in London in February of 1775. In this beautiful Carolingian building, which was previously a royal residence, Sir Ashton sought to pursue natural history and carry the exhibition of it to such a height that no one could imagine, and to make it the most wonderful sight in the world. He succeeded in doing so, and we know that because it was attested to by contemporary accounts of scientists, journalists, and visitors from all over the world. The museum did, as its name implies, really embrace all of nature, and it aimed at universal appeal, from child and unwashed masses to the jaded socialite. In many ways, it was a rival to the British Museum, and the Halafusikon ultimately proved to be too much of a financial burden for one man, and in 1786, it was sold at lottery. So we're going to take a look at the remarkable collection of the museum and think about where it sort of fits into what we've just looked at and discussed about the objectives of museums. And ultimately, we can see where some of these objects are today. So again, the origins of this museum find their roots really in this idea of the cabinet of curiosity. Originally, that described a room in a house as opposed to like a piece of furniture. But those collections of objects came primarily from fields of natural history, geology, and ethnography, as well as antiquities. Emerging in the 16th century, they began first as sort of entertaining rooms of the aristocratic class, but members of the merchant class and early practitioners of science began to form collections as well, all of which we learned were sort of these precursors to museums. So these are two sketches of the museum, of one of the rooms in the museum. During the late 1700s, the study of natural history was sort of shedding its medieval constraints, and people were left sort of questioning this knowledge that they had of the natural world. And into this, enters Sir Ashton Lever. He was born in 1729 in Alkingreen, Lancashire, near sort of middle Manchester. And he was a member of the landed gentry, descended from cloth merchants, and he was wealthy enough to indulge in his interests in natural history and collecting. But he was a little eccentric, he was a little kooky, and his interests began with collecting live birds. He eventually built and owned an aviary that had nearly 4,000 live birds in it. But in 1760, he began his love affair with sort of collecting natural history and cultural objects. He purchased first a large collection of shells from France, and soon began to replace his live birds with stuffed ones, adding fossils, shells, and other animals along the way. His first public display of a collection of birds and beasts was a temporary exhibition in Manchester in 1766. By just a few years later, he had printed his first leaflet listing items that he wished to acquire. And so it went out in publication in newspapers all across England that he was looking for sort of any production of nature or art, anything curious. And so he included instructions on how to preserve and pack, and requested notes giving details about specimens, about their collection in the field, as well as their provenance and use. And so he amassed a really large collection that ultimately opened to the public in 1771. There was no charge to visit his museum, which was at his country home in Alkrington, and he personally toured many people through the collection. It was just too successful. And in just 2 years, he was sort of fed up with all of these people coming to his house all of the time. And he was forced to publish a notice in the Manchester Journal to inform them that he has now come to the resolution of refusing admittance to the lower classes, except when they come provided with a ticket from some gentleman or lady of my acquaintance, and I authorize every friend of mine to give a ticket to any orderly man or woman, and to bring 11 persons beside himself, whose behavior he must be answerable for, according to directions he will receive. So he began to get a little fed up with all of these folks just turning up and wanting to see all the weird things he had in his house. So he tried to put some restrictions on it. Later, he even started to refuse admittance to anyone who arrived on foot. And a fun story was recorded that one gentleman sort of circumvented this rule by getting on a neighborhood cow and riding the cow up to the front gates of the house. Sir Ashton Lever, who was a little odd in and of himself, found it pretty funny and admitted the gentleman. Oh, sorry. So one of the earliest accounts of the museum was published in 1773. And at that point already, the museum included a great number of antique dresses, parts of dress of our own and other nations, nearly 200 species of warlike instruments, tomahawks, scalping knives. There were more than 1,300 glass cases containing curious objects placed in 3 rooms. Rooms of fossils and natural history, and many more. In 1774, visitors numbered just over 1,000, but in July. By August, there were more than 3,000 people visiting the museum, and there were so many visitors during the summer of 1774 that ultimately he was persuaded to leave Manchester and move the museum to a larger institution in London. The new home for his collection was the Leicester House, which was purchased in 1718 by the Prince of Wales, who later became George II, for his residence. So it was a very expensive home for this new museum. It cost more than £600 a year in rent and taxes, which would roughly be $92,000 today. So Lever hoped to really support the collection through collecting admission fees. He started pricing his fees pretty high, but ultimately reduced them down to an affordable 2 shillings 6 pennies. And so it was an affordable amount for the working man. Here, the large rooms were separated by arches, forming sort of a continuous loop of rooms, with mirrors added to increase the illusion of space. All of the cases were painted white because he thought that it would show off like birds' plumage better and all the different carvings. There were 13 exhibition rooms with living quarters for both Lever himself and a gentleman who he had employed to sort of superintend the museum. Later, 4 more rooms were added to the museum. And this expansion was necessary, particularly to accommodate specimens and artifacts from the second voyage of Captain Cook. It was noted that Cook admired Lever so much that he gave him a complete collection of all kinds of South Seas curiosities, which were vaster than the ones in the British Museum. And so the years 1780 to 1783 were pretty much like the high points in Sir Ashton Lever's life. His collection, particularly the birds and quadrupeds, was really unrivaled in the country, and its natural history exhibitions and the South Seas curiosities were sort of the most valuable collections in the world at that time of those types. People noted that what they liked about the museum was that they could walk around for hours without the need of a guide because every case contained the name of the article on a small printed label stuck to the glass. And one man even said that he was surprised the British Museum, with all its natural rarities, didn't follow that example with at least major objects. It would be great help to the guides and a great service to the public. Really, the best collection description comes from an edition of European magazine from 1782 in January, which listed the exhibition areas, and you can see that on the right, and described their contents. There was additionally an outhouse, although not an outhouse as we think of it, but a small sort of exterior room that contained a full-grown preserved elephant and the zebra, which when alive had belonged to Her Majesty. The staircase exhibition area included weapons of war of different nations, chiefly European and Eastern, skins of serpents, horns, bones, teeth, and heads of animals, sharks' jaws, an elephant tusk weighing 113 pounds, that was noted. And so there were lots of articles published in books and attractions and places of interest, all listed sort of this museum as the museum to visit when you were in London. The royal family even visited the museum in 1778 and called it an infinite honor to the kingdom. And in June 5th of that year, George III actually conferred knighthood upon Ashton Lever. But in spite of all the public attention, by 1780, there were serious financial difficulties confronting the museum. And so he appealed for annual subscribers, which we would call museum members, writing that basically if he couldn't raise enough funds through these museum members, that he was going to have to sell the collection, and he just didn't want to do that. It would break his heart to have to disperse his collection all over the world. And so he wrote these long appeals that were published in newspapers everywhere, that he wanted to continue to share his delight with everyone. But his appeals didn't work, and Lever was forced to sell his remaining Manchester properties to continue on paying the rent in London. That worked for a few more years. In May of 1783, he petitioned Parliament to add his collection to the British Museum rather than be broken up and sold at auction. England, however, was more concerned with the aftermath of, I don't know, this little thing called the American War for Independence. So England's government was not going to interfere in any of this. But they did approve a lottery. In 1784, they approved a lottery by an act of Parliament, which empowered him to sell 36,000 tickets to sort of raise like a raffle. You want to think of it like that way. He could sell 36,000 tickets to raise up to 37,000 pounds to sort of reimburse him. And whatever ticket they pulled out, that was the winner of his entire collection. Well, the lottery was in and of itself not a success either. There were only really about 8,000 tickets sold, and so Lever really received about 8,400 pounds for his life's work in the dissipation of his fortune. The winning lottery ticket winner was drawn in 1786 on March 23rd, and the museum went to a man named James Parkinson, who was like a lawyer in London. He tried to sell the museum at half its value. Possible buyers were like the Queen of Portugal and the Empress of Russia, but when no sale materialized, he kept the collection, but he moved it. He moved it to Blackfriars Bridge. And in September 1st of 1787, they opened this new museum at the Rotunda in Blackfriars Bridge, just south of the Thames. In its new home, its name was changed from the Hall of Fusicon to the Leverian Museum. And it was under his ownership that it sought to be more educational, a move that we know was sort of in line with what was happening throughout the museum world at that time. He published 6 books on the collection with contents described case by case, and it was the largest collection in the world to be open to the general public at regular hours. But even here, the museum was not populated enough. There wasn't enough admission to the museum. Despite the fact that by 1806, the museum, the leverian, was really synonymous with the word museum, the venture was not commercially viable again. And so it was offered once more to the nation to purchase. All but one members of parliament agreed on the purchase of the museum this time. Ultimately, it came down to Sir Joseph Banks. Well, Banks hated Sir Ashton Lever, the original owner of the collection, and out of revenge, disapproved the purchase. In a letter, we find from other parliamentary members that Sir Joseph Banks had bitter spite against Sir Ashton Lever, and when the latter's museum was again offered to the nation, Sir Joseph declared there was nothing in it worth the purchase, and thus the ill temper of one man deprives this great nation of the finest general collection ever formed in England. And so Parkinson himself finally resolved to sell the collection at public auction. And that took place in May of 1806. And it lasted from May to July. So it was a very long, continuous sort of auction. Some of the purchases at the sale became important parts of well-known British and foreign public and private collections. The Empress of Austria purchased items. So did the Empress of Russia. The Royal College of Surgeons bought pieces. The Hunterian Museum in Glasgow, the Liverpool Museum, and even sort of the private collections, both in Europe and abroad. The importance of the museum's collections were really seen in the number of drawings for scientific works on natural history that were made from specimens. And they served as important functions in furnishing models for artistic renderings of exotic subject matters for European artists. The most prolific artist in the Halafusakan and Leverian Museum was Sarah Stone, a young female watercolorist whose artistic career really centered on the museum. Her watercolors can be found in 4-bound sketchbooks, hundreds of loose drawings, and many more finished works, some of which were engraved. These are 2 of her watercolors here. When Parkinson offered the contents of the museum for auction, he could not have imagined the importance of many of the ethnographic works of art, the importance that they would have even 2 centuries later for museums, private collectors, and most importantly for the descendants of their makers. Individual ethnographic artifacts that can be traced to the 18th century with certainty are relatively few. And those that can be associated with the voyages of Captain Cook have really acquired their own biography, beginning in the islands where they were made and progressing to individuals who used and traded them and gave them to Cook and his men all the way into London. So a lot of the objects that were acquired by Sir Ashton Lever had their portraits painted by Sarah Stone and other artists. And after auction, when they moved all over the world, these historical illustrations have allowed scholars today to sort of track down a lot of these objects. Along with museum records, they have been able to sort of find where all of the objects that were once in the Halafusakan have ended up all over the world. So we're going to take a really quick look, just a few minutes here, at one of the objects from the Halafusakan to its home today. And in doing so, we can understand sort of how museum display and audience and objective have changed. So on the right, you can see the actual object. On the left is a watercolor drawing of it from the journals of Sarah Stone in the Halafusakan. And this was lot number 4351 of the Leverian auction. It was a brown feathered cloak from the Sandwich Isles, which is Hawaii. And it was purchased by William Bullock for his Liverpool museum. It was collected on Cook's second voyage to the Pacific and was most likely collected from the Big Island. Brought back to London by Cook and his men, it was given by Cook to Lever, and where it was available for the public to see. And it was painted there at the Halafusakan by Sarah Stone. And it's sold at the Halafusakan lottery, of course, to Parkinson. And it was displayed in his Leverian museum. And ultimately, when the Leverian museum sold, it was sold to William Bullock in the 1806 auction. Bullock was a jeweler and a goldsmith, but he was an antiquarian by interest and by wealth, of course, and he opened a small museum in Liverpool in 1795. He had acquired quite a number of objects from the leverian sale, and his museum was eventually moved to Piccadilly into a museum that was built to model an Egyptian temple, and so it became known as the Egyptian Hall Museum. He charged 1 shilling admission to the main museum and an extra shilling to visit the Pantherion, which was a novel gallery exhibiting animals in a naturalistic setting. You entered through a long corridor made to look like a rocky cave, which opened into a tropical forest. And so accurate models of exotic plants and animals sort of gave the appearance of reality in that building. And so this gentleman had this museum open and people could come and see this cloak. But ultimately in 1825, he decided he didn't want to do this anymore. He wanted to travel the world, and he sold the building and all of its contents. Well, he sold this thing at, he sold many things at an auction in 1819, but the feather cloak wasn't in that auction. Rather, it was given by him to the Rugby School in Warwickshire, England, an independent boarding school whose ties to him are sort of murky at best. But we know that the cloak hung in the dining hall of the boarding school for more than 100 years. Before it was acquired by a man named James Hooper in 1938. James Hooper was a private collector, collected art from all over the world, was very into those sort of ethnographic arts. And after he retired, he actually opened the Totems Museum in Sussex, which was sort of a 2-story building that housed his collection. And he ran that museum between 1957 and 1963. And the cloak was among his possessions. The museum was a modern cabinet of curiosity and was opened to the public. And so when he died in 1971, the collection was virtually intact. And by June of 77, his whole estate went up for auction, and the objects that he had acquired were dispersed in 3 auctions at London's Christie's, Mason and Woods. The sales brought in a total of more than $2 million. Top collectors came from all over the world, and the most important part of Mr. Hooper's collection, and the last segment to be sold, was the Hawaiian and Maori art and artifacts, which fetched more than $1 million themselves. As was expected, the most acclaimed treasures of the sale were the Hawaiian feathered cloaks that Hooper had, and he had many. So the particular cloak that came from the Halafusakan was sold to the Bishop Museum in 1977 at that auction. The Bishop Museum was founded by Charles Reed Bishop, who was a businessman and philosopher, in memory of his late wife, whom the museum is named after. She was born into the royal family and was the last legal heir to the Kamehameha dynasty, which had ruled the Kingdom of Hawaii from 1810 to 1872. Together, the couple had already founded the Kamehameha School, which was an institution benefiting Native Hawaiian children. But upon her death in 1884, her husband built the museum, the Bishop Museum, to house the family heirlooms that had been passed down to him by royal lineage of his wife, and share them with the people of Hawaii. In 1898, Hawaiian Hall and Polynesian Hall, the 2 original buildings of the museum, were built on the campus of the Kamehameha School in the popular sort of Romanesque architectural style. They were at the time dubbed the noblest buildings in Honolulu. But since its inception, the mission of the museum had always been to inspire its community and visitors through the exploration, celebration, and perpetuation of the extraordinary history, culture, and environment of Hawaii and the Pacific. Much like the community museums that began to operate in the United States during the early 20th century, the Bishop Museum was a museum meant for the local community to help instill in them a sense of identity, to reflect their rich history, which had been whitewashed and quite literally stolen from them in the illegal overthrow of the monarchy just a few years prior in 1893. So the opening of this museum in and of itself was a pretty revolutionary act. serving its community faithfully, the museum was quite successful and is very successful to this day. In 1940, it was able to expand when the Kamehameha School relocated. And in the 1970s, they added thousands of objects to their collection, sort of welcoming them back home. And this included the cape from the Hall of Fusicon Museum. Returning the cloak to the island of Hawaii from which it was taken in the 1700s is a really impactful moment. The cloak was accompanied from England to Hawaii by a group of native Hawaiian kahuna, or priests, who watched over the object in its travels. It was welcomed back to the islands in a ceremony and brought back to the museum for safekeeping and for sharing. And it was last shown in a really beautiful and meaningful exhibition in 2015, the Royal Hawaiian Featherwork exhibition, which toured a few locations in California and the mainland. And so we can see that, the way that a single object has sort of been displayed throughout time has really changed as museums' missions have changed and our understanding of art and our service to the community has changed. And so we're really going to dive into some big museums next week and take a look at the history of, we're going to take a look at 2 different case histories next week, as well as take a look at the future of virtual museums, which is a big new sort of emerging field. And so over the next couple of days, I'm going to update our shared file with this recording from our class today, as well as with some additional readings for anyone who is interested. And as always, I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I hope that if you have questions, please feel free to ask. I'm here. Or shoot me emails, text, call, however you want to get in touch with me, please do.
Teresa, I've got a quick question.
Yep,
you were talking about the Whitechapel Gallery in the East End of London.
Yes.
Is that still around?
It is. Yep. You can still go to that gallery today.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sharon?
The question is, have the museums around the world got together and decided about returning some of the artifacts that were in effect stolen from other countries?
That's a great question. It's certainly been a sort of hot button issue since the 1970s, really.
Okay.
There has not been too much progress made in when it comes to the larger museums. When it comes to, let's say, the British Museum, the Vatican Museum, those are home to many of sort of the looted treasures of the world, if we want to call it that. Only recently has France sort of made the decision to work on repatriating a lot of those objects. The United States, of course, works very closely with Native American groups, but not anyone outside of the country. So it's still an ongoing thing. There hasn't really been any sort of consensus reached by museums overall.
May I comment?
Yeah.
When I was at the Kansas City Museum, what is that? The Atkins, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
They have an extent, and this was October of last year. Okay, they have an extensive Chinese collection, and they did make a point of saying that these items had been purchased, and they did have someone that had been in China in the I guess when Chiang Kai-shek, was in power, that type of thing. And they were purchased. So there's a part of me that says, I think we need to make a distinction. In some cases, items were purchased, and in other cases, they might have been confiscated.
Absolutely. That is something that a lot of museums have been sort of moving towards, making that distinction. Certainly, it's a distinction that museums are happy to make if they don't have objects that are considered looted or stolen. It's very easy for, let's say the Museum of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg has a beautiful pre-Columbian collection and a really beautiful small African collection. Those objects have great provenance records. We know when they were purchased. They were all relatively modern purchases. So we have a good record of where they came from. So it's easy for that museum to say these were purchased in an ethical, legal fashion. The British Museum is probably never going to put up a label saying that something was purchased, because then you'd go to the next object and see the label wasn't there and say, well, how did this object get here? And it sort of raises more questions than it answers for those museums with sort of iffy collections.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But overall, I would say that museums definitely are moving in the right direction on that. There's certainly a lot of guidelines in place today about, you know, sort of cutoff dates about collecting from pre-Columbia and throughout Asia and places like that, where if it's before a certain date, you basically don't touch it as a museum professional. Any other questions for today? All right. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your support of the museum. Your fee for the class goes to help us in our education efforts and our education outreach. And so I look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.